At the end of 1997, several nations stated that their oil reserves had not changed since the end of 96. So for that entire year, they had not changed. That's what they said, right? They had not changed since the end of 96. So apparently they stayed the same. But oil reserves gradually drop as oil fields are drained and rise suddenly as new oil fields are discovered. Okay, that makes sense. You use your oil and then you discover more, so this is bizarre. Therefore, oil reserves are unlikely to remain unchanged from one year to the next. Unlikely to, but not impossible, right? Thanks. Are you cool with that?
Yeah, like they could just stay the same. Some could like some could go, maybe.
Yeah. Like this is just several nations, so some nations maybe they stayed the same, whereas most nations did not. I don't know.
Which one is this?
Number 16 on page 357. So most of the nations stating that their oil reserves were unchanged are probably incorrect. I don't know. They could be the exception to the rule, right? Like they didn't say at the beginning that all nations stated their oil reserves did not change, or most nations, just said several. So you have this group of nations say, hey, ours didn't change. And I would say, well, even if oil reserves are unlikely to remain unchanged, they're likely to change. That just means they're likely to. There certainly could be instances or cases where they don't change. You cool with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So most of the nations stating that their oil reserves were unchanged were probably incorrect. Well, maybe, but I don't know. I'm a little skeptical of this. Necessary assumption. So what are we looking for? Has to be true. Has to be assumed, right? What were you debating? Or should we just go through it?
We should go through it because I debated C and D and that's third.
That's always fun. All right, so A, for any nation with oil reserves. Okay, I'm a little nervous about this already because it's talking about all nations with oil reserves, right? But let's just read it. It is more likely that the nation was mistaken in its statements about changing its oil reserves than the nation's oil reserves remain unchanged. So yeah, this is making an assumption about all nations with oil reserves, right? Whereas we're drawing a conclusion only about nations stating their oil reserves were unchanged. That's a specific group of nations, right? So I feel like we don't need to make this assumption for any nation with oil reserves. Like what about the ones that didn't make any claims about their oil reserves? B, it is likely that in 1997, in most of the nations that stated that their oil reserves were unchanged, oil fields were drained or new oil fields were discovered or both. Do we have to assume that this sort of event occurred to them? Happened to them? I think we have to. Otherwise, they're the exception, right? Wait, Alex, what do you think about that? What if this...
I get it now that you explained it. I think the conclusion saying that they said that if they said they were unchanged and they were probably wrong. So
yeah.
They were changed. Is what they were.
They're probably changed.
They're
yeah.
probably changed.
Yeah.
Which this supports. I misinterpreted the conclusion, I think.
Okay.
Because it makes sense that if some were drained and some were new, then there was a change.
Yes, and this is the rationale that the person gave for concluding that they probably changed. So we have to assume that in the nations that stated that their oil reserves were unchanged, this sort of conduct or, these sort of events occurred to them. Because if they did not occur, right? So yeah, then it's unlikely that they would have changed. They would have stayed the same, and the conclusion would be wrong. Let's take a look at C and D because you were tempted by them. During the course of 1997, the oil reserves of at least one nation not only gradually dropped but also rose suddenly. I don't know that they had to do both.
But that could be changed if one dropped more.
Sure, it could
or
be.
increased more, or rose more. I don't know. I think that's why. I was like looking for like the disconnect that there were some new ones and some old ones.
I guess I feel like this doesn't have to be true
Okay.
because it says oil reserves gradually drop as oil fields are drained and rise suddenly as new oil fields are discovered. Oil reserves at least one nation not only gradually dropped but also rose suddenly. I feel like
I mean, B makes a lot of sense, so I probably would make that one.
I mean, my initial gut reaction was like, do they have to do both of these things? Now I'm wondering if it also kind of has to do with the fact that this is not likely, whereas answer choice B is just saying it's likely, whereas the conclusion is just saying they're probably incorrect, right? It's kind of a weak conclusion. It's not saying they're wrong for sure. It's just saying they're probably incorrect. So there's this possibility that no one actually is incorrect, whereas C is saying this had to have happened. Like, you don't necessarily have to have a nation change and this conclusion be wrong. Like, they could say, yep, actually no one changed, but that's my conclusion is still valid because I was just saying that it was that they were probably incorrect. Maybe they were all correct. It's just very unlikely for them to be correct. Therefore, that's why B sounds so good. It is likely that this happened. You have to assume that it was likely, so then you can conclude that they are probably wrong.
Okay.
Let's take a look at D. If a nation incorrectly stated at the end of the night that its orders had not changed, then during that drainage, so this is the same problem.
Yeah,
This is going too far. It's saying that this did happen, right? Whereas the conclusion is only saying it's very, very likely that it did not happen, or that they are wrong. In other words, they're probably incorrect. They probably did change, but maybe none of them did. Maybe none of them did. E, if a nation's oil reserve changed from one year to the next, then the nation is obligated. We don't care about obligations.
yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you